I'm Eleanor Hines from Resources for Sustainable Communities. As Bob Cecil pointed out earlier, I provide staff support for the Cherry Point and the Fidalgo Bay Aquatic Reserve Citizen Stewardship Committees. Bob is the president. I strongly urge all of you to talk to him or some of the other committee members if you guys want to maybe raise your hands. So people look around, look at all the committee members, talk to them during lunchtime, see how you can get involved because there's a lot of cool stuff. So I'm going to talk about the Intertidal Monitoring Program at Cherry Point. It is one of the, there's other programs that the Cherry Point Citizen Stewardship Committee also has going on. So this is just one of them and one of the things that you guys could all be citizen scientists too and help us collect the data. So first, a little bit on the aquatic reserves. How many of you guys have ever heard of or knew that Cherry Point had an aquatic reserve? All right, that's exciting. There's also a lot of DNR staff here too. How many of you knew that there is a Citizen Stewardship Committee? Okay, a little less. So I urge you guys to all get involved. For those of you who didn't know, their overarching goal is to conserve the unique habitats, flora, and fauna of the aquatic reserves through leadership in scientific monitoring, which is what I'm going to talk about, environmental literacy, community outreach, education, which is sort of what we're doing here today, and cooperating with government and non-government organizations to better implement the management plan. So I already covered this. I'm going to fly through some of these slides because I want to make sure I don't get between you guys and lunch, pizza. So why intertidal monitoring? It basically started because we wanted to know what's there. We also wanted to see, are things changing, and this happened a little bit after we got started. We started doing our monitoring in 2013, but things like sea star wasting syndrome, like it would be great to be able to capture those things as they change, but we might not know what they are until we actually see them happen, and it might be too late with some of the sea stars. We don't exactly know what might have been going on before we started doing some of those surveys. So hopefully we're able to capture some of that data here. And also in case of, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with Cherry Point, how there's the Aquatic Reserve, and right next to it there's an industrially zoned area. And so it might be better than having shoreline armoring everywhere and residential areas. There's pluses and minuses to it all, but there are 3 docks there. So in case of something like oil or cargo spill or something like that, we want to know what's there and what might be missing and how those things might be impacted or how they may or may not change. So there's some pros and cons of citizen science. It is a really efficient way to gather data. It also engages citizens. So if you haven't engaged in any citizen science in the past, I highly encourage you to. It's a really great way to learn a lot of new stuff. Our trainings will teach you how to identify a lot of organisms. And then it's also fun because then you get to go out with your friends and family and show off all the knowledge that you've learned and help them to maybe get engaged and more interested in learning about what's there in the nearshore environment, and then help encourage them to protect those areas too. Some of the cons are we aren't all experts. We do have a number of experts who are actually here today. They're all sitting in a row right there with Marie up front. And they are wonderful. They are volunteers and they have decades of experience in the field, and so they're wonderful in helping all of our new citizen scientists to correctly identify organisms when it might be a little bit hard. We are also, one of the other cons, traditionally with citizen science programs, is the availability of the data. We go collect it and then it goes sits somewhere, like the, I guess oh, why am I spacing on their name? The Beach Watchers program on Island County did this for 25 years, and it just sat in boxes for like 25 years. And it's not until recently that someone finally started looking at the data and figuring out what's going on. So we want to make sure it gets out to not only the resource agencies, but also to the people that are involved in the community. So some of the partners involved, so the Fidalgo Bay and the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserves do these intertidal surveys, but also the Whatcom and Skagit MRCs have also done a few of those, and so that's sort of housed through the Northwest Straits Foundation to help facilitate those. And the Coastal Volunteer Partnership at Padilla Bay also helps to host our trainings down in Fidalgo Bay, and we're hoping to get something similar up here in Whatcom County. So Birdie showed a map. I think this one is a little bit older than, because it doesn't show the new freshwater reserve, but in red are the two sites where the aquatic reserves are doing these intertidal surveys at Fidalgo Bay, Cherry Point. And so at Cherry Point, we have a couple of sites. We usually sample at 4 per year. So I didn't add on our newest one, which you'll see a photo of at the end, but we've actually started surveying at Barnacle Rock. Initially, we started sampling at Birch Bay, and it just wasn't quite right. It's very sandy substrate, and we're finding a lot of stuff, and it was really hard trudging through the mud for volunteers. And then the next year, or last year, we went to Point Whitehorn Point, and there was so much stuff. And realistically, with the number of volunteers we have, it was just impossible to count every single thing that was there. So this year, we went to Barnacle Rock, which seems like the Goldilocks site where it's just right in between the two. The other sites we have are Point Whitehorn Park, which is where we host the annual What's the Point event, usually the first Saturday of June, which I encourage you to attend. It's really cool. You actually get to go out on the beach, and if you ever had any questions about what you find at the beach, that is a great time to have those questions answered. We also look at Intalico and Neptune Beach as well. And then Fidalgo Bay, we also look at a couple of different sites there as well. So the main components of these intertidal monitoring surveys are we do profiles, where we look at the profile of the beach, which didn't seem too interesting to begin with, but over time it actually seems really interesting how these beaches might get eroded or not eroded, and there might be accretion happening or not happening. We also do species swaths, which are usually conducted by our experts. You guys look like a panel over there. And so they do presence and absence of species by where they're found along the beach profile. And then we also do quadrats, and that is what most of our, well, the quadrats are right here. And so that's what most of our citizen scientists do, where they look at the percent cover of certain species, and then they do individual counts. And so this is the basic layout. We have our profile line. So this is the backshore area here. This is our profile line, and as the tide goes out, we mark the +1 tide height, +1 foot, 0 foot, and -1, and then we lay out transect lines that from the profile line, it's 10 meters on either side, and then we have 4 quadrats that the first quadrat is randomly placed, and then each one afterwards is placed equally from there. And so that's where, so at each quadrat, volunteers will go over and do their percent cover count and then their species counts. And I'll talk about one of our lessons learned about this in a little bit. And I also, this is Wendy Stephenson here, who, she might be coming later today, but she did a lot of work to get these up off the ground. And I took over for her when she had to move on to bigger, better things elsewhere. So I'm sorry I'm not gonna go too in depth about with the data, but we're going to quickly just look at an example of one of the sites. We started sampling in 2013. We only have the data entered 2013 through 2015, so stay tuned for more coming soon. Jonathan is trying to quickly enter all the data so we can get that available to the public soon. And so one of the things that we're finding is there's just a lot of variation in the system. So I don't quite feel comfortable telling you guys, we aren't really seeing any stories from just 3 years of data. Also, this is a monitoring program, and so we have a lot of data, and so taking the time to look at all of those different possibilities that are going on takes a lot of time. And just 3 years is probably not quite enough to really see those changes happening. But it's also interesting too, because we have these other programs like the Sea Star Wasting Syndrome, surveys that are interesting. We also have the ocean acidification that's going on. And then the Whatcom Marine Resources Committee is also adopting a kelp survey site where they do kayak citizen science surveys out there. So it'll be interesting over time. Oh, and there's also the Citizen Stewardship Committee also does marine bird surveys out there. And so as we collect all this data, it'll be interesting to see, you know, are we seeing differences that, you know, where everything's being impacted, or are there, you know, interactions happening? So Neptune Beach, I forgot, it's way down here, the most southerly one. So these are the profile lines. One of the things that we learned was, and I'll show you a graph of a more extreme one later, one of the important things is making sure with the profiles that you are starting at exactly the same point every single year. So we're not entirely sure that this like little hump there is changing or staying the same quite yet. So we're trying to tighten up our protocol to make sure that we are able to see those changes, because it is interesting, you know, to see how this profile might be changing over time. And then also, we also started noting which tidal height on the profile. We were taking those quadrats at those transects. So that also might be interesting to see over the years. There's a lot of variability, like I said before. What we also found out too is that things like some of these species, like barnacles, for example, some of them get really, really tiny out there. And so we used to do this extensive training trying to get people to identify all these different kinds of barnacle species, which if you've ever done it, there's a few different, you know, telltale signs of what it is, but it's basically how their plates come together. And as they get smaller and smaller, it's harder and harder to see that. So we decided eventually that, you know, it's not really reasonable to expect our citizen science volunteers to identify all these different ones. Plus, there's a lot of uncertainty in the data where someone might call this one barnacle something and a different person might call it something else. So it makes more sense to just lump some of these things together. So that was the percent cover. So the percent cover is usually like the animals and the plants that you would not want to count individually, like barnacles. And then algae too, because it's too hard sometimes to tell. It's just easier to do a percent cover with those. And so here are individual species. And one thing that I'll talk about in a little bit is that we started removing all the species, which is that like sea lettuce that covers everything. And I'll show you a picture of that later. Oh, right here. So we had citizen scientists out there that went, there's so much Ulvis species here, which is this green sea lettuce, and they really wanted to count we only count an aerial view, and so they got really, really frustrated that there were all these organisms that weren't getting counted. So we talked with DNR and a few other folks, and we decided now we do our surveys where we do them with the Ulvis species and then do them all over again without the Ulvis species, because there's a lot that's underneath there. And this green algae, oftentimes it'll cover a beach quite extensively for a period of time, and then it'll completely like disappear and not be there. So we try to keep our surveys pretty consistent to the timing of the year that we sample them, but we figured this was a better way to look at it. Also with the lumping of the species, with green algae too, sometimes it's really difficult to tell all of the different types. Marie Hitchman up here does a really excellent job of helping us with that, but for the quadrats, we decided it's better to lump these species, and we'll let the experts try to figure out which species it is for the species swaths. This is a more extreme example of the profile lines, where this actually was a site that surveyed. It's the first site at Fidalgo Bay, and it's surveyed by high schoolers. And clearly this year, I think that, 2013, they started way further back at, I think, a fir tree, which is how it got its name. And then the subsequent years, they started at the true backshore. So that's one of our lessons learned, where we need to make sure that we're keeping things consistent and consistently training our volunteers. Because we can see really cool things when we do it right. So some of the challenges are, consistency, like I just said. The annual trainings and protocols can help in each year. We're trying to do it better and greater. but there's all these people and they all do a great job, but what somebody might qualify as a certain kind of substrate, a different person might qualify it as a different substrate. So we're trying to tighten those things up to make sure that we can get that consistency so that we have a little bit more confidence in our data. So some of the next steps are we want to evaluate our protocol with a citizen science lens, because there are a lot of constraints. So we want to make sure that we do collect data that is meaningful and that we have confidence in it. And I think there are ways that we can do it. We just need to sit down and talk it out a little bit more. We also want to work on some data visualization tools to help the public better understand the data. We're collecting this data. I think there's possibly some cool things in there. And we want to get people excited about what we're finding out there, because Cherry Point in particular is a really unique habitat area with a lot of cool things that I think would be great to share with the public and help them better understand that. We also would love to work on more adaptive management for the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. There's all these citizen science programs going on, so it'd be great to really evaluate the data with the lens of how can this better help manage the aquatic reserve. And long-term recruitment and retention. So we have these lovely people here who help us out, and they're experts, but they're also volunteers. And you can only expect so much from volunteers, and eventually they're going to get sick and tired of helping us out. So we need to look in the long run at how we're going to be able to sustain the program to make sure that we can recruit wonderful people like those guys over there. And I wasn't going to say that, but yeah. She's still going out. Yeah. And one last thing I wanted to share with you guys. Michael sent me this photo. So I guess in this photo, I can't figure out exactly where it is. There is a sea star wasting syndrome plot on here. It's Big Rock. I think it's somewhere, is it around there? Ish? Down? There? Yeah, that one. Okay, that's Big Rock. That's where one of the sea star wasting syndrome sites plots are. And then in addition to that, who was at the Barnacle Rock Intertidal Monitoring date? Who was out there? Can you guys find yourself in the photo? So one of the other cool, I have lots of photos of doing these surveys, but it wasn't until Michael, every couple of years they do aerial photos. 4 years they do aerial photos, and it just so happened that it was the date that we were doing our new site, Barnacle Rock, and there's our profile line right there, and there's some of us out there, so I just thought that was kind of cool. They have some color to them, so yeah, and that's this. It got a little blurrier as I zoomed in, so, but yeah, that's our starting point. Yeah. 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 So, we've been caught on camera. Yes, Ellie? Yeah, that is part of the next steps in evaluating the protocol. We also want to evaluate, what are we collecting the data for? Just collecting monitoring data to collect monitoring data can get really frustrating when you're trying to find something in the data. So we want to get together with partners and see, what questions do other people have in this data and what can be useful. Another thing that I forgot to mention that we also look for is it's sort of an early detection system for invasive species. And as some of you, I think, are aware of, we've seen European green crabs starting to come into the Puget Sound area. So if anyone is interested, I think these might be out of print now, so please use them wisely or take a look at them. I'll have them on the table up here in the front if you want to look at them during lunchtime. So that's all I have. happy to take questions, but I'm also happy to transition into lunchtime too. Sure. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So for those of you who might not have heard, Melissa and Marie were just saying that there is value in just monitoring. Hmm. Michael, do you have an answer to? So the question was, were there studies done before they put docks at Cherry Point? Yes.
There's a literature base going back to 1954 on the Cherry Point shoreline, basically on the Aquatic Reserve. And much of that is generated by the two refineries along with Intertidal. And for instance, the Ferndale refinery ran a monitoring, ran a beach monitoring program in 1954, essentially through the presence of Eleanor Hines. Most of it is seeping. Some of it is proprietary. Some of it was paid for by most of it was paid for by the industry. And nobody's ever asked it. Well, don't ask me, I asked the industry, I'm sorry. Let's talk about it.
So there is data out there, and I also wanted to point out that the Aquatic Reserves has a wonderful website, and if you go to it, if you go to the reserves, you can look up more information about the individual reserves. If you go to resources, you can find some of the reports that have come out on the bird monitoring as well as the intertidal surveys and other things like that.